Jr., Vice President of Geologists, Jackson Hole. Again, welcome. Just as an aside, the reason all these tables are out here is because when we came into this side, there was somebody already set up for an 8 a.m. program tomorrow morning. So we negotiated and moved stuff to the side here. So actually, we'll move those things out of the way at the very end so that you can do your usual, you move the chairs to the side here at the very end. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Brian Atwater to you. Brian has been with the USGS Geological Survey since 1973. He's an affiliate professor since 1986 with the University of Washington. His bachelor's and master's are from Stanford University, and his PhD is from the University of Delaware. What he is going to talk about here tonight is one of the things that he's probably most known for, and that's using studies of coastal geology to really help prove that there were giant earthquakes and will be giant earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest and what the evidence for those is. For this and related work, he won the Kurt Bryan Award of the Geological Society of America. And he's produced a widely used public safety book, Surviving a Tsunami, Lessons from Chile, I probably should say, Hawaii, and Japan. And amongst a lot of publications, he's brought a copy, but I bought my own too. He published in 2005, along with co-authors, this book on what he's going to talk about tonight, which is really basically the giant tsunami that occurred at 9 p.m. on January 26th in the year 1700. He's going to talk about how that is known to be. So he's also done research on sea levels, glaciation in California, ice age floods from Montana. He advises earthquake and tsunami scientists in other places around the Pacific. And I think he's going to be talking about that tomorrow at the lunchtime program, so at the Senior Center. So again, that's open to the public. You can come and not eat lunch, or you can buy the $4 lunch if you're the age most of us, many of us are. Otherwise, it's $8 if you're a youngster. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Atwater.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Let's see. This is working. Yes. Oh, good. Okay, I need help right away with local geology. When was the last time you had the coast right next to you here?
The coast? Well, it depends on whether you're talking about the inland Cretaceous sea or the Paleozoic.
Okay, so an open coast, not facing an embayment.
Paleozoic, long time ago.
Hundreds of millions of years ago, before the dinosaurs. Is that fair? Okay, so on this map, you can see the area we're going to today. It was unknown to this compiler of a map for the King of France, who was mainly on the West Coast using Spanish information as far north as Cape Blanco, Oregon, and then everything else unknown. And what about does this get to as far east as Jackson Hole, or is his coverage cut off there? I don't know the geography here enough, but
I'd say we're in there.
You think you're in the pink or in the what? Out in the unknown territory?
Northern Rockies.
I think we're about at Impasse.
Okay.
Because the Missouri swoops down into Yellowstone.
Okay.
Right on the edge.
Okay.
Long, shut it down.
Well, anyways, this puts us in the time and place of the main event, the one that John mentioned that's the subject of this talk. And as he said, it's a case of using. There are lots of ways people use geology, right? You use them for natural resources. You use them you need geology to clean up environmental problems, and you need geology as a guide to natural hazards and how to work with them. And in this case, we're using a geological detective story as a kind of a long-term warning system. People usually think of warning systems as instrumental things that where you get a beep at the last minute, whereas in this case we're talking about an advisory from Earth history itself a part of Earth history that overlaps with human history to the point that you can have a map like this that doesn't show the subject area of the talk, right? So it's a very recent, it's just 100 years before Lewis and Clark, and yet it takes until the 1990s that modern science knows anything about it. So after that finding was made, here 2005, so just a year after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, the state of Oregon put up this this image that doubles as a sort of a tsunami warning from state officials, it's presumed that many Native Americans they would have been the first ones they would have sensed the earthquake and then had the tsunami coming in shortly after it, and they would be among the victims. It's not known that lives were lost for want of written records. But then the tsunami goes to Japan, and it does enter written history in Japan. So we actually have written records of this North American tsunami, but those records are in Japan. And from a Japanese context, here you have a subducting tectonic plate. Let's see if I can get this guy to work here. There we go. Let's try. Yes. Okay, so that's the downgoing, in this case, Pacific plate, the floor of the Pacific Ocean, diving underneath the continental rocks of Japan, essentially. And there's an observant cat, as you can see. And the plates are stuck together and the spring is getting loaded, right? And then the earthquake happens, and in the Chinese characters up here, that's earthquake, and those two are tsunami. And this is a public safety cartoon, right? That's meant to teach the association of earthquake and tsunami. It's 95% of the people in areas that got wet in Japan in 2011 survived the tsunami, and a lot of them did because this message had been drummed into people in Japan that earthquakes and tsunamis come together. But what if the parent earthquake for the tsunami is on the other side of the Pacific? So that was the situation in Japan in 1960 when the largest earthquake anybody knows about in the south of Chile occurred. And that's the reason, John, for that public safety booklet is that a tsunami that was devastating in Chile marched across the Pacific, took 61 lives in Hilo, and then continued to Japan and took people by surprise in Japan, and they had 138 fatalities in Japan. Okay, so that's the situation with our North American tsunami in 1700. Is that it goes across the Pacific and registers there, and it's not this. They're only getting this part of it. They're not sensing the earthquake. So you all can read this, right? There's any Japanese readers here? No? Anybody take a Japanese course ever? Yeah. So you can read probably some of the kana.
Yes.
Right, and that's sort of the level of my. There are a couple up there for sure, but this is interesting. This one's written by a village headman who's not educated in the way the samurai were, and so a lot of the words he doesn't know how to render them in the squish spider Chinese characters. So he uses simple phonetic symbols, so it makes this document more readable. But this is his setting. This is his setting. He's down on this pine-covered peninsula down here. That's Mount Fuji before an eruption in 1707 gave it its present asymmetry. And the highway running across there goes to what's now Tokyo, then Edo, the shogun's capital, on the right, and to the left was the emperor's capital, Kyoto. And let me give you a flavor of what this village headman wrote. It's just a straight English translation from the Japanese. He starts off by giving in the Japanese calendar when this happened. And then he says that water became high tide or something like entered, ego within pine groves, within the pine trees you can see on that picture map. And then the water went out like a big river. Then it became calm. There were, let's see, he tells you, that there were 7 times about the water rose. So it was a train of waves. The tsunami is usually a train of waves. So a public safety message on this would be train of waves, right? Never heard of waves of rising condition because of village old and young, shrine to escape. Probably what he means is, I suggested that the people who get $4 lunch go up to the shrine, okay? That's me, too, right? I'm 67. Okay, so unusual, okay, then he says, to the old asked, but unusual the waves' appearance, they said, so that village entire was puzzled. You know, what are these things, right? And then he shows you his book learning, and he uses the Japanese equivalent of etc. And apparently to a modern Japanese scholar, this is hilarious, that this guy is trying to sound academic and it falls flat. But anyways, he's inquisitive. His is the one eyewitness account, really involved, worried that his people are going to get in trouble because he just had 2 lives lost in a typhoon in September of 1699. So he says, tsunami and such, that's his etc. Tsunami, wild waves and such. What is called such a thing could it be? For many years to come, remember well must. Furthermore, earthquake and such, and here he shows that he knows the cat cartoon. Earthquake and such happens if that reason, yotonami, it's some other kind of waves, and such are things that come, it is said, but this village vicinity in earthquake any did not happen. Okay, so he knows the cat, he thinks, God, that's got to be a tsunami, but where was the earthquake? And you know, and finally in North America in the 1990s, people figure out, it came from here. All right, so here's mute testimony from Native Americans. There are also Native American traditions, but for a geologist, I like to be a field geologist, I like to lay my hands on things. And in this case, you had people living on a sand dune. They were processing elk at this place, actually. This is a good thing for Jackson Hole. They could clean out some of your 8,000 elk. And then tsunami comes in, and the land has dropped during the earthquake, so that afterwards tides cover the place and permanently put their site out of commission. So in cartoon form, it looks like this. Before the earthquake, you have the elk camp in operation. The land drops during the earthquake. Tsunami comes in. And then afterwards, the tides cover things up, and you're left with this geological evidence, okay? And you'll see variations on this theme. But fundamentally, this is like earthquake ecology. You know, that during the earthquake, with certain kinds of earthquakes, this kind, that you get change in level of coastal land. And that changes the environment, and then the geology can record that change, right? And if tsunami comes in association with that, as is the case with this example, then you have a kind of a cause and effect link, right? So that's the basic story here. You could walk out of the room now and you'd know what I'm going to tell you, because this is the guts of it. Okay, so the same map we saw, but now with the rest of the world that the French king could learn about in 1720, and so we're going to start. We're going to look at land level change during earthquakes, starting in Chile in 1822. I'm going to skip the California example. We'll go to Washington State in 1854, and then to the 1964 Alaska earthquake. Okay, so for the 1822 one, it's important for the geologists in the room probably know of Lyell, because what's the book called? Principles of Geology. First published, I don't know when. It's published before 1834, 35, as judged from this story. This guy on the left was also an attorney, both of these guys lawyers, and he was president of the Geological Society of London at a key time in this land level story. Basically, though, there was a dispute between Lyell and Greenough as to when, under what circumstances land levels could change. And for Greenough, the only way it could happen is if you have a volcano that swells. And for Lyell, it wasn't a problem to have land levels on coast change for other reasons. And it's a woman who discovers, in a way, or first writes in a convincing way about land level change during an earthquake. And Lyell quotes her with approval in his book. Greenough decides to go after her as a soft target. Lyell doesn't stand up for her, and she stands up for herself in a really wonderful way. So here she is. That's her self-portrait in Chile. She had arrived in 1822 with I don't know whether the body of her husband was with her. He was a ship captain who had died at sea. She ended up in Chile just after Chile's independence. She took up with a mercenary who was the founder of, a British mercenary who was the founder of Chile's Navy, Thomas Cochrane. But her profession was travel writer, and she was very good at it. And yet by some modern accounts, she was probably the kind of polymath who was tuned into lots of scientific things going on back home in England. And so she's there on the ground for an earthquake, and she notices that land level changed. And she probably is aware even of the battle between Lyell and Greenough already. And so she informs the Geological Society of London about the effects of this earthquake. So how does she do that? Can she make a presentation, as I am doing here, to the Geological Society of Jackson Hole, right? All the women would have to leave the room because women were not allowed in as members of the Geological Society. So she could not go in the room and even present it. So she writes a letter to Henry Warburton, who proceeds to present, extracted from her journal, what happened. And so here's the guts of what she says about this. We'll go to this place. At Quinterno, I went to examine the coast. This was about a week after the earthquake, accompanied by Lord Cochrane, the mercenary. Although it was high water, I found the ancient bed of the sea lay bare and dry. Oh, I've got a picture of it. There. So she went from Quinterno, probably on horseback, down onto this beach. With beds of oysters, mussels, and other shells adhering to the rocks on which they grew, the fish, that is the soft parts inside the shell, being all dead and exhaling a most offensive effluvia. I found good reason to believe the coast had been raised by earthquakes at former periods. In similar manner, several ancient lines of beach consisting of shingle mixed with shells extending in a direction parallel to shore to the height of 50 feet above the sea. So she's got this stuff figured out. And And our good friend Greenough waits for 10 years because he's nursing his dispute with Lyell, and in his presidential address, and 10 years after she publishes this through Warburton, he attacks her. And his entire presidential address is an attack on the credibility of Maria Graham as a witness. And his conclusion is, if I am to pronounce a verdict according to the evidence, I believe there is not yet one well-authentic instance in any part of the world of a non-volcanic rock having been seen to rise above its natural level in consequence of an earthquake. So she reads this, and she proceeds to send a letter to the Geological Society. And she says, by this point she's remarried, and she's Lady Calcott. And she uses Bob Dole speak. She refers to herself in the third person, okay? So she says, Mrs. Calcott has read with surprise an extract from Mr. Greenough's anniversary address to your society in which there is an uncourteous attack upon her letter addressed to Mr. Warburton in the year 1824, 10 years before, giving an account of the earthquake which occurred in Chile. And then she proceeds to summarize the attack from Greenough and then to rebut it in turn. And her almost cry from her heart that gives her motivation. Mrs. Calcott, this is her last paragraph, is very sorry to have been forced to say so much of herself, but she thinks it is due to her family and friends and to the society in which she's always moved to repel so disgraceful a suspicion of falsehood on her part, right? Which, if it were to the smallest degree founded, must render her unworthy either of society or friends. So, I mean, she's really wounded by this, right? But she lets him have it. So here's an example. The facts detailed to her by Mr. Warburton and stated more at large in her published journal are strictly true. Mrs. Calcott had ample means and leisure to examine the coast at Quintero. And she saw the difference between the old high water marks on the cliffs, beach, and rocks from 3 to 4 feet higher than the high water ever reached again during the 2 months she remained in Chile after the first great shock. She is indifferent whether Mr. Greenough ascribes this to a partial elevation of the coast of Chile or to a change in level of the whole mighty Pacific Ocean, which must have extended to Polynesia, India, and China. The fact is that there was a change in the relative position of land and water, and to save circumlocution, Mrs. Calcott will continue to use the word raised or elevated in describing that change. So it's really wonderful what she did. So she's the ground floor of that. And then we fast forward just before the Civil War. We have Jefferson Davis as Secretary of War, and he's commissioning 4 transcontinental railway surveys. And a person who becomes the first territorial governor of Washington State, Isaac Stevens, he's killed during the Civil War, 1862. He arranges to get himself, in addition to being territorial governor, put in charge of the Northern Survey over the head of a person he worked with named McClellan, James McClellan. So he refers here to Professor Baird. That would be Spencer Baird, who was on the ground floor of the big collections of natural history at the Smithsonian. And Baird cultivated collectors to get an idea of the flora and fauna and rocks of this continent. And so you can see Stevens' ambition written here, altogether the most complete that has ever been set out, even better than Lewis and Clark, right? And then he writes the botanist, the physician we're going to talk who's our observer, our collector, Cooper. And he's hiring Cooper. And you see what he tells him about, he's laying down the law as to what Cooper can bring with him. No, he's worried about transportation. No mattresses or bedsteads can be carried into the field. All right, so here's Cooper apparently traveled without a mattress. And this is the cover of his journal, which you can go and finger at the archives of the Smithsonian. They've scanned the whole thing and put it online. You can see he's acting assistant surgeon, and then he crosses something out. And naturalist, Northern Pacific Railway Survey, commenced June 15th, 1853. And the thing that he saw in Southwest Washington is the opposite of Maria Graham's story. Maria Graham's got land rising. This is evidence that land dropped. Okay, and that's the key. You saw that already with the fishing camp, with the elk camp, right? The land had dropped. Okay, and so Cooper writes this up eventually. It's published in 1859, 1860, just before the Civil War breaks out. While he's working on this manuscript back in Washington, D.C., he goes and dines at the home of Robert E. Lee. When he had arrived on the Pacific coast of Washington's, what's now Washington, I guess it was by then Washington Territory, he goes to Fort Vancouver, and his quartermaster is an industrious lieutenant named Ulysses Grant. So he's in, and he escapes the war completely. He ends up in California during the war. All right, so here's Cooper on a certain kind of tree. He's trying to show that the wood is durable, but you can read what he said. Shoalwater Bay is now Willapa Bay. It's just north of the mouth of the Columbia River. All right, so Cooper's subscribing to gradualism here. The field evidence shows instead that it was a sudden change in land level. And one thing Cooper didn't have the advantage of was the '64 Alaska earthquake. But that came along at a time when the jargon we use as earth scientists for the way that there are parts of the exterior of the Earth that move around with respect to one another and rub against one another and sometimes dive under one another. This plate tectonics, that term hadn't been coined. What we call today subduction of one diving under another, that term had not been applied in this way. But Plafker, in a post-earthquake survey with '64 Alaska, recognized such widespread land level change, uplift like Maria Graham's uplift of barnacles and other things in the above the area that's partly enclosed in the dashed red line, the rupture area, and then behind it, encircled in blue, this big area of this big downwarp. The maximum was only like 5 feet or a bit, maybe 8 feet. But it was enough to cause big environmental changes. And the example we'll look at is outside of Anchorage at Portage. And what Plafker's essential story was that you had to have the oceanic the ocean floor diving under the continent and being usually stuck together at the heavy brown line, so that as the ocean floor keeps moving towards the continent, it's stubbing its toe, and the land is bulging up between at this time between earthquakes. Then the land drops during the earthquake, right, and the seafloor gets kicked, as in the cat cartoon, so you drive the tsunami there, but you also lowered coastal land. And after the tsunami is done, the tree will be in an uncomfortable place. So here's the first big post-earthquake high tide pouring over the remains of a highway bridge and underneath railroad cars at 20 Mile River outside of Portage in April of '64. big cubes of ice and then during the summer, Portage, the gas station having been a victim of the lowering of land. I mean, you could think of it as the elk fishing camp, the elk camp for the natives to the south, a couple centuries earlier. And behind Sitka spruce, so I got to go there in 91 and then again in 98. And you can see the remains of the gas station and the ghost forest of Sitka spruce. And the landscape's starting to recover, getting revegetated and preparing to record the next Alaskan earthquake, right, in this way. And go down on a stream bank, and you have this marvelous thing of the soil of the willows and the spruce that had been there before, and there were even moose nuggets in growth position right on top of the droppings of moose right on top of the buried soil. And then up through here, each of these layers represents a different high tide, and there are cycles of big tides and smaller tides in this stuff. It all probably represents the summer of 1964, and so it's just all building up very quickly, rebuilding that landscape. All right, so Maria Graham, she really her work was not widely appreciated, but certainly Plafker's was with 64 Alaska. And so when plate tectonics identified a subduction zone as running along this part of Western North America, and it was partly the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1982 that called attention to this as an active subduction zone. Then the question arose, okay, what kind of subduction zone is this, and can it make very big earthquakes? And there was nothing in written history here since Lewis and Clark. So this sausage-shaped area here that's meant to represent this part of the fault plane, the question was whether it was lubricated or whether it was just waiting, and it takes a long time between these very big earthquakes for them to be incubated. And what does this mean for the cities of Portland and Seattle, right? So this work was nudged along. Maybe that's too gentle of a word. By the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There was in the 70s initiated a construction of 5 nuclear power plants, 3 of them over at Hanford, and then these 2 out near the Pacific coast, near the Washington state capital of Olympia. And the consortium went bankrupt for reasons mostly unrelated to earthquake hazards. But after the bankruptcy, there was this plant here that was 3/4 completed. And for the bondholders, the Washington Public Power Supply System tried to complete this plant. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission saw that ideas were changing about the subduction zone, which at the time these plants were designed was not even thought to be active. Okay. Now there was, by the early 80s, there was a consensus that the subduction zone was active, but what wasn't known was its earthquake potential. Was it just magically lubricated, or was it stuck and waiting to produce another? And the NRC wanted resolution of that problem, right? So they went to earth scientists, and I was among those at the receiving end of funding that was very helpful for getting certain kinds of analyses done that hastened the solution to this problem. So it's something of a contrast with Fukushima, which these reactors designed at the same time as Fukushima was, but the watchdog agency here in the United States made a big difference. So down where Lewis and Clark wintered, there's gangbuster evidence for abrupt lowering of land, but they were there in the dead of winter when the tides are high and during the day, and maybe they had other things to do, so they didn't tumble to it. But by the late 1980s, geologists had checked river mouths and bays at these various yellow dots, and had seen evidence of the same style as the elk camp or the portage evidence of abrupt lowering of land. So it's a very widespread thing, and it was a very nice social phenomenon where, in science being a competitive game, the people working in Oregon had every reason to shoot me out of the water for what I was doing in Washington State, and likewise the Californians and the British Columbians, right? But there ended up being, I don't think it was a bandwagon effect, being a consensus that this is what had happened. And the main clue was this earthquake ecology, just the mirror image of Maria Graham's story, but the portage story, right? Where the land drops during the earthquake and the trees are made uncomfortable by the tides afterwards, and thanks to our friend Cooper showing the red cedar standing dead in the marshes there in the 1850s. They're still there in some cases, and then Sitka spruce rots away real quickly. We saw that at Portage, but you can see its stumps in the bank. So here I'm standing on the roots of Sitka spruce in a buried soil from the year 1700 here, and then there's one from around the year 400 that's down here that also has spruce roots in growth position. And at my feet was the soil that I've dug away here, and you see the beautiful condition of the roots. A Native American woman, a storyteller, collected these little spruce roots here and proceeded to weave a basket out of them. You can tell there's no oxygen that's gotten into this. This is rusting, but this has never seen oxygen. And then you can see the sand sheet here, right? There's another sand layer there that's probably part of the Tsunami or the whatever it was. All right, so a picture of Cooper again, a person for scale standing on spruce roots in the bank of a tidal stream in southwest Washington at low tide. And then this is a brackish water tidal marsh with these out of place western red cedars standing. By this point, they've been standing dead for nearly 300 years, right? And they're hollow inside and rotting, and there's a lot of, there are maybe 1 out of 10 of these are still standing in the past 30 years. They've gone away. Okay, so there's evidence for, I mentioned that there was one around the year 400 in this cartoon that has time running along here and then some age symbols I'll explain. We have a cartoon view of land level change as just an ecological change, where the higher the surface gets, the sweeter the soils, there's less problem with salt water or water logging, and so forests get to spread downstream is essentially what happens. And if you have a long time between earthquakes, as in this case here of about 1,000 years, then there's time for the forest to spread. And that happened before 1700 too. Now these give you a minimum lifespan of some of the red cedar that were killed. But the yellow bars that just show you how poorly I did my job. So where I couldn't date the event very well, the bars are very wide, right? And where it's a very narrow line, then the event's been dated exactly. And you can see it's very easy to predict earthquakes because they happen at very regular intervals, right? Okay, so yeah, I mean, usually people have to resort to saying, oh, on average, there's a 1 in 10 chance in 50 years or something like that. That's what you do with that record because it's 500-year average. Okay, we've seen a variation of this already. This is another telltale, but we're embellishing the story of land level change by having the tsunami come in. And so in this case, you can see the buried soil of a salt marsh that was similar to this one. These trees are living on an upland, so they don't have anything to worry about. And then the rust is just a distraction. And So we'll zoom in. We've got school teachers from middle school science teachers out here, and they've tacked a nylon window screen against this that crosses the buried soil, and the sand sheet is there and there. And they've painted through it a water-loving glue, and then they're going to peel it off. And you can see how clearly the buried soil of the marsh, and then the lines representing the wave, the sand, each of them probably representing a different wave in a tsunami wave train. And then above that, the mud that doesn't, this stuff up here that's got some rust from roots, modern roots going down into it, that represents the post-earthquake tide flat because the land had dropped, okay? So that with a tsunami, the mechanism, people say, oh, an earthquake caused a tsunami. But really it's the movement on the fault that sort of Maria Graham stuff, right, with the shoreline being raised, or you saw it in the cartoon. You're changing the level of the ocean floor. And so naturally, the adjacent coast may also undergo a land level change. And what this sequence shows you is that the tsunami comes in on the heels of the land level change. This estuary this is Wilpa Bay. It's so muddy that mud rains out in between individual waves here. There's a lot more to the earthquake ecology here. There's lots of use of microscopic fossils. Some of them are amoeba-like creatures, and then there are these plant-like affairs that are very important for the world's oxygen. And these particular species that Eileen has worked with are ones that live on sand grains. And so she finds that those are characteristic of the sand sheet we just looked at in that sediment peel with the teachers. Okay, so a lot of that work was done in the late 80s and early 90s. and it ended up reaching an impasse over the size of the earthquake. And it had to do with the kinds of timepieces we have as geologists. There are two different hypotheses that are shown on this cartoon. Over here, it's a single big fault rupture that from start to finish might take 5 minutes. Over here, you have 3 different fault ruptures, and they could be decades apart, okay? But with the dating tools that we have, it's usually very difficult to distinguish between decades apart and all at once. And so that was the source of the impasse. And a further complication is that subduction zone elsewhere are very good at doing this. Southwest Japan produced a dinner sausage in 1707, and then in 1854 it produced breakfast links, 2 of them 32 hours apart. And geologically, how are you going to tell that difference, right? This remains an issue today, a really big issue, because what happened eventually, after the Japanese help us out and say, you know, you're probably the dinner sausage in 1700, it became very popular to think that this subduction zone routinely produces magnitude 9 earthquakes. And that's the way the guidance for engineers is written today. The guidance for tsunami evacuation is written with that near worst case in mind. And this alternative receives scant attention. And some of it, I think, is just a social effect of the disasters on the Indian Ocean shores in 2004 and Japan in 2011. They have giant earthquakes, well, we must have them too. And it's also, but it's not that cynical. I think it's, you know, people would rather err on the side of caution, but then you get into Voltaire's business about what's le mieux l'ennemi du bon, the perfect is the enemy of the good, right? And it becomes hard to do things, to take precautions if you always assume the worst case. So these are some of the current, this this 1990s issue is still with us today, and it's a very difficult one to deal with because it's scientific, geologically it's hard to deal with, but it's a social science issue too. Okay, our help from Japan came most of all from the woman here in the blue hat, and her name is Ueda Kazue. And her brief story, to tell her story briefly, she was an overqualified person working as an assistant for a theoretical geophysicist who during the Vietnam era was locked out of his office by student demonstrators for 2 years. And he said, fine, I have a hobby of going out in the countryside and rummaging through these old books of Japanese records and compiling a catalog of Japanese earthquakes because I want to be able to predict them. And Japanese history is so long, maybe I can see patterns. And he got money from the Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, which is the Fukushima people, right? I mean, they were serious about this stuff. And so she's among those who does this work, and in the end they come up. The village headman's story is one that they come up with, right? And there are a bunch of others, and they end up with this: that they have. You have to kind of read this graph backwards. That their observations are all these: that in a Japanese calendar and clock, such and such happens. They first notice the tsunami in Japan, right? And then you take the travel time by jet plane, because that's about the speed of a tsunami, between Seattle Tacoma Airport and Narita outside of Tokyo. And that's your 10-hour transit for the leading edge of the tsunami in this tsunami model picture. And from that, you can get the evening of 26 January 1700 in Gregorian calendar, which hadn't been adopted everywhere, right, at this point. And it was left to a Japanese-American tree ring scientist he's not in this picture. His father is here and his grandfather is here, his aunt. I know that all of three of these end up in internment camps during the war, and after the war, this man's son gets a scholarship to Yale, where he diversifies the Yale population this would be in the 80s, and he comes back to University of Washington and ends up working with prehistoric eruptions of Mount St. Helens, and he dates some of the eruptions using the rings of trees, and so this equips him to tackle the question of when did Cooper's trees die? Are Cooper the one, who couldn't bring his mattress? So here's David with one of the radii that I've written the dates here: 1500, 1600, 1700. It goes out to 1986. Weyerhaeuser, the timber company, struck a deal with the Fish and Wildlife Service that allowed Weyerhaeuser to cut on the perimeter of a piece of old growth that the Fish and Wildlife Service preserved. And David went in on the heels of the loggers and got radial pieces, and then he also sampled standing dead ones. And he ended up with a master barcode of good and bad years for climate-wise, good and bad years for trees, right? And then he could compare them. So here are some of Cooper's trees back here, standing dead still, and David could go out there and get samples of them. So his experiment looks like this: the mouth of the Columbia down here, and the reference trees that were sitting up on top of a hill. We call them witnesses because they were unharmed by the lowering of the land. Their elk processing facility never saw tidewater afterwards, right? They're still up high. So they live on until Weyerhaeuser cuts them down. And so they have good and bad years, and so did their cousin that was living dangerously close to tidewater before the 1700 earthquake, and afterwards that one has dropped, of course, right? And so its trunk wood it's been eaten away by woodpeckers and fire and the elements, but if you get a geologist with a shovel, you can dig down and find the roots with bark on them, and you can go out to the last year of the tree and you ask the tree, when did you die? Did you die in January 1700? The Japanese scientists tell us that you should have died in January 1700. If you did, then according to the Japanese researchers, to move enough water to cause the flooding and damage that's shown by the village headman's document and others in Japan, you need a magnitude 9. So this would solve the question of whether it was dinner sausage or breakfast links, right? And also give you an exact date. So, you know, this was a tree ring test of that, and the tree rings of the 8 trees that we were able to do this with. 1 from here, and 3 from here, and 2 from there, and 2 from here, I think. One of these up here lived on till Copalis lived on till 1708. It had a root that was up on a nurse log. But all the other ones, the final ring was a complete ring from 1699. So the trees had lived through August or September of 1699, and then the Japanese tsunami is in the Japanese records of the North American tsunami, really, January 1700. And the trees don't put on any 1700 wood or thereafter. They're gone, okay? So it was a demanding test. It was a much better clock than we had before. And it gave confidence that the Japanese written records in fact refer to a North American earthquake, and therefore it defined for us in a way we couldn't before the time. This is interesting. So I failed to turn off my cell phone. I have exchange students in Seattle who are from Muslim countries. They're observing Ramadan, and I bet they've failed to show up at school, and so now I'm getting a call from the school saying that they... Okay, so anyways, all right, so here's what the story I've just spun I think implies for the hazard that that you have to get the land to drop along the coast. You can't let the fault extend far underneath, because otherwise the rocks moving up the inclined plane will raise the coast. To drop the coast, what you need to do is stretch the rocks. That was the Alaskan interpretation. And the next one, depending, it could be breakfast links or it could be dinner sausage, as far as I'm concerned. For other people, it's got to every time it's dinner sausage. And if it's 500 years on average between them, then on average you got a 1 in 10 chance, but you saw how variable the recurrence is. And generated inland, we don't have proof of this, but the Alaskan situation just horrible, because most of the deaths from 64 Alaska were from slide-induced tsunamis generated inland, not the open ocean tsunami. And the shorelines, of course, would be drowned, and then after post-earthquake, then the storm waves can really eat into the coast. All right, so that story plays out with these things that we call national seismic hazard maps. They get updated every 6 years. They guide building codes. I'm sure that this building's new enough that the engineers who designed it would have had to follow certain standards that were ultimately set by these maps. You know, engineers will translate the strength of shaking, like this ground acceleration figure here, these contours. They would translate that into how you attach together the parts of the structure. But if you look on the maps that were made in the 1980s, there were none of these hot colors out here along the coast. So there are in place now along the coast of the Pacific Northwest. There are precautions against earthquakes that didn't used to be there. And a really nifty thing that's come up is this story. It's kind of amazing because this Westport has a weak economy. And they have a lot of, they've got their share, more than their share probably, of social issues with drug use and whatnot. And yet, when they needed to replace an elementary school that was in an area that tsunamis reach or can reach, and they had no high ground nearby, they decided to tax themselves to build a vertical evacuation structure that can hold 2,000 people on top of the multi-purpose room. So here they are with their golden whatevers. And here's from dedication back in 2016. And this is the roof of it here. And you have a tsunami eye view of this structure. This wall here is meant to be blown out by a tsunami, so the tsunami can't put much pressure against it. And then the strength of the building is in 4 corner stairwells. You're seeing the 2 seaward ones here. There are 2 more in the back. And they, together with some pilings along the side, support the roof that can hold 2,000 people and keep them above 30 feet above ground surface. So this in a way is this is sort of a practical example for the benefit of school kids, especially of paying attention to hazards that you wouldn't know about without the help of geology. So that's a pitch for the geological. I'm losing track. It's geology of geologists. What's the organization called? Geologists. Geology of Jackson Hole. Okay. So, anyways, that's a further use of geology. Maybe it's rather remote for people here, but for people this far inland, but along the Pacific coast, it's a useful thing. Anyways, thank you for your patience. I'm sure I've talked too long. I meant to encourage questions, comments while slides are on the screen, but please speak up. Yes?
As a practical matter, how much is the Pacific Northwest doing to protect themselves from what ultimately will be a pretty bad tsunami?
Okay, well, did you read the New Yorker?
Yes.
Okay. Did you notice that the writer didn't mention this? Did you notice that the writer didn't mention the changes in building code maps? That's not to say that what's being done there is sufficient, but what it does say is, to me, that article was sensationalized. And in a very unfortunate way. I took that writer in the field. I said, you must go visit the Augusta school, and she just blew that away. And so there were some disappointing things about that, but that notwithstanding, this is a very big challenge, to motivate, and especially because you don't get frequent reminders. The only reminders but you do get. Okay, these people first voted in this school district. They first voted it down. And then the 2011 disaster happened in Japan, and they put it back on the ballot, and they did some additional campaigning, and it passed like a margin of 2-1. In this and they got no help from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is now contributing to additional vertical evacuation structures near schools out on this part of the coast. So there is a momentum that almost these people shamed others into doing something about it. So yeah, I mean, there's stuff being done. I'm sure it's not nearly enough, but it's not like people are clueless without a New Yorker writer to tell them. Others? Yes?
What the evidence that you had for Japan, was that just the tip of the iceberg, or is that all that can be found about the tsunami in Japan? In the 1700s.
Okay, so there are six primary sources, or as nearly primary as you can get, for where a 1700 tsunami was noticed in Japan, where this has been written up. Okay, and two of them are from an official book of records from areas that were devastated by the 2011 tsunami north of Sendai, and in that case, there was a feudal domain that had an inland capital with a castle, and people working in the castle keeping the books. And then they had samurai stationed as magistrates out on the coast. And the magistrates sent by FedEx, it took a week, their reports on what had happened. And then people took those letters and entered them into the official books. And they're there. I mean, they're still there, preserved in the inland place. And they're quite, one of them reads like it lays it out, like it says 20 houses were, let's see, I can't remember which way the numbers work, but anyways, I think it's that 13 were destroyed by fire. If you look at videos of the 2011 tsunami, you see examples of floating fires as houses that were entrained by the tsunami. So they may have had whale oil as at night. They may have had whale oil or something going, and in case fire spread in the flooded area. And so they tell you that, and they tell you that they made an appeal to the person in charge of the forests to get some low-grade wood to rebuild the houses, and that they issued emergency rice. It's very, very official document written by samurai. And then there's another one that's really interesting. In this case, northeast of Tokyo, a rice boat. And so rice was almost like the currency. And in Edo, now Tokyo, the feudal lords of these various domains had to maintain official residences and be there on alternate years, and their wives and families had to stay there full time. It was a method of control and also impoverishment to the expenses that they had. So these people had to send in rice, their currency, to Edo. So one of the northern daimyo, feudal lords, sent this rice boat with 30 tons of rice. And it got to a river mouth as the tsunami was happening, and the water was going in and out of the river mouth with probably the same waves the headman noticed, where he said 7 times or something. And when you get a strong ebb current going against incoming swell, it throws up big waves. So the captain chose to stay offshore, and then a storm came up and swept his boat into the rocks, and 2 sailors lost their lives, and all the rice was lost. And the local villagers went down and did some salvage work, but then they said, oh, we're going to get in trouble. So they went to the local samurai and said, okay, we need an official report that clears us of any problems here. And maybe the captain also needed an insurance document. But in any case, there's a book of shipwreck records that contains this whole story. And it's just laid right out there. So it's a very interesting mix of documents that attest to this tsunami. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I'm just curious, along the coast there from Portland north, do they have active evacuation plans in place? Do they have warning system to if something's coming, and do the people actually know what to do and where to go and how to get there?
So, you know, you've touched on, especially with warning systems, a really a difficult point, right? Because there's enthusiasm to have a human warning system, and you need it for the tsunami that's coming from Alaska, because you're not going to feel it. The cat cartoon's not going to work for you, but the cat cartoon otherwise is meant to tell you that the first warning you receive will be, and maybe the only warning, timely warning you will receive, will be the earthquake itself that you will feel. And so you use that as a natural cue to go to high ground. So coastal emergency managers on that stretch of coast have the challenge of communicating to people, well, we're subject to two basic kinds of tsunamis here. Ones that come from far away and for which we will give you a warning, and ones that are generated nearby, for which the earthquake itself may be the only warning. But that second part with a cell phone generation, I mean, you know, maybe it doesn't exist unless you can see it on your cell phone. So that's one of the big challenges is in education, and for that matter, how do you deal with the worst case? Do you present people only with the worst case? Do you assume that the level of sort of tsunami awareness is such that you tell them only about an especially juiced up magnitude 9 earthquake as a source that gives you a tsunami that makes most people drown rats? And so, you know, that's a quandary for people too. So there are moves afoot to offer scenarios, different ones, but there's great fear that that's going to cause confusion. So it's just not a, you know, it's not a simple. You can't easily predict what in the spectrum of tsunamis you're going to get from a near field one, from one generated where you do feel the earthquake. It's a real challenge. Has that addressed your question, or is there more?
That's good enough. The second question is, do you have a good record of how high the wave was, how far on shore it came?
The geological record is on low ground, because that's the easy place for the sand to get laid. Essentially, you pick up the sand someplace and you move it through a forest or a marsh, you slow the water down, the sand grains drop, okay? And it's hard to trace the sand grains up the sides of the hills. There are some examples of stream terraces that have sand up near Claylock in the Olympic National Park. A geologist found that. But the heights are left to the people who make computer models, and they're the ones in the end who are producing the tsunami inundation maps that become the evacuation maps. So this is part of an answer to your question I should have given, is that the state of Oregon and state of Washington now also are in their second generation of tsunami evacuation maps. They had a set of them that was designed more or less for a repeat of 1700. They're now making maps that show a far more demanding tsunami, and that's the line they're putting on the maps. And but in any case, it speaks to the seriousness of the effort that they're revising, and even if the use of a worst case has its pluses and minuses.
I just wanted to add, you can go online and see the inundation. Actual inundation from those maps. The state of Oregon publishes inundation maps that show various t-shirt sizes of tsunamis, and then those are meant for a technical audience, kind of. They're plotted on a topographic base that uses laser surveying to get a very good idea of the shape of the land. But they've run the computer simulations across that across that topography. And then from those, they've extracted simplified maps that they put in communities, each community having an evacuation map. And the evacuation maps show gathering places or where the local officials hope to be able to deliver supplies, and they try to encourage people to use certain roads and not others. A big issue as to whether people are going to be able to drive any of these roads after an earthquake. What else? John?
Brian, how long does a set of waves like that take to play out?
Maybe, okay, so John's question, how long does the wave train last? Kind of depends on the receiver. If it can get to a place where the tsunami can resonate, they'll go on for a while. And there was loss of life in Chile in 2010, something like 3.5 or 4 hours after the earthquake. The tsunami evacuation had been declared over, and people went back down into a place, and then there was some oceanographic phenomenon that somehow created very big waves that came in and took lives. So that's an issue. So I don't know, maybe the other issue though is how quickly do the initial waves arrive, right? So you look at the Japanese example from 2011, every tsunami is going to do this differently depending on where the source of the tsunami is with respect to the shore. But essentially the initial shape of the tsunami wave is the shape of the warping of the ocean floor. Okay, so you might have a big bulge offshore, and then if you go onshore towards the coast and you've got a downdrop, then you just have a curve like that. And then that waveform will simply move towards the coast. So you look at Japanese tide gauge records, after the earthquake, the water levels drop and drop and drop and drop, and then the positive wave comes in and knocks out the tide gauges. So that's up near Sendai that happened. But that was like 25 minutes that the first big wave came in, so 25, 30 minutes. The numbers for our coasts are quite variable depending on where you are.
Is the geometry off of Washington similar to the geometry off of Japan, i.e. the distance of the downgoing slab? Subduction zone to the shoreline and all that?
Maybe a way to put that question is, what would the initial shape of a tsunami wave from the warping of the ocean floor look similar off Washington as it did in 2011 in Japan? And at least in Japan, also in southern Chile in 1960, the coast dropped and the uplift was offshore. So to that extent, you've got some similarity there. But one of the problems in Japan was that there was an influential view that if the downgoing ocean floor was formed back in the time of the dinosaurs, that it would be quite cold and it wouldn't be buoyant enough to stick to the overriding continental rocks. So it was thought before 2011 that northern Japan probably could not ever see a magnitude 9 earthquake. And so that was one of the elements of surprise and it's, it feeds into the structural geologists realm, but this was an influential geophysical view, and it was one reason that Cascadia was identified as a likely source of very big earthquakes, because the oceanic rocks going under that part of North America, they're quite young, so it's thought they're so warm they push up against the overriding plate and get stuck. Yes? Others? Okay, well, I'm here, so come up. We still have 10 minutes before we get booted, right?
Well, a couple of things real quick. Brian will be at the Senior Center tomorrow, and we'll be talking about